Welcome, counselors, to Transio's Financial Aid webinar. We're going to be discussing a variety of things to help you and your students navigate FAFSA and the FSA ID. My name is Ann Herbener. I am our Education Services Manager. I just retired after 36 years in education, the last 20 as a college counselor and department chair. So my role with Transio is everything college, including our college product, but also educating counselors about different aspects of the college application and admission process. The first thing I want you to think about is, what is your role with the FAFSA? Completion of FAFSA is the #1 indicator of college matriculation. If you can get students to do the FAFSA and apply to a college and they get their financial aid, they're probably going to enroll and actually attend campus. If we drop the ball with FAFSA, they aren't going to get money and probably won't matriculate in the fall. So what is your role? Do you just send out FAFSA information and then students and parents complete on their own? Do you help students create FSA IDs to get them started? Do you hold a financial aid night to educate parents and students? Do you lead actual FAFSA workshops where students log in and complete a FAFSA? Do you have times when you complete a FAFSA with students one-on-one for students who maybe don't have parents that have the time or inclination to help them? Or do you monitor FAFSA completion? When I first started out as a college counselor, I was #1. And through the years, I found out that my students and parents needed more FAFSA help. I had more first generation and low income students than I originally thought. So I progressed through all those steps. Towards the end, our state had a portal where we could monitor students who were actually completing the FAFSA. And then I could reach out to students who hadn't and look at the colleges they were applying to and get them to complete the FAFSA. So that's something that takes a little bit of time and education, a little bit of extra work on your part. But when you help someone complete the FAFSA and it shows that they're Pell Grant eligible, which means they're going to college tuition free, that leads to more job satisfaction on your part and starts to create a college going culture for you students. I would like to introduce Leah Nicholson to you. She's going to introduce herself, but this is our agenda for today. FAFSA, what you need to start, some common obstacles, some special circumstances, which we've all had to deal with in the counseling office, types of financial aid, comparing financial aid packages, and looking forward, how the FAFSA is going to be making some changes to simplify the process. Leah is the Director of Student and Financial Assistance for the Kansas Board of Regents. She also worked at the University of Kansas in financial aid, so she's had experience on both sides of the desk. I'll let Leah finish introducing herself. Leah.
Hi, everyone. So yes, again, my name is Leah Nicholson. I have worked in financial aid and higher education for about 8 years now. So everything from counseling students and families on the ground level up to my role now, which is administering aid programs in the state of Kansas. I have also been involved for the last 8 years in our Kansas Association of Financial Aid Administrators. So I'm still very well connected in that group. As a committee member on a variety of their outreach and training committees. I like to pride myself in being a resource for students and families in the state of Kansas, and I'm very passionate about making the financial aid process easier for families. So to start off, what we will be talking about today is the FAFSA and all the different ins and outs that you should know in helping students get through this process. So first of all, what is the FAFSA? Everybody always mispronounces the acronym here. And so it is FAFSA, F-A-F-S-A, and that first F in FAFSA stands for free. So it is a free application for federal student aid. And so I'd really like to emphasize that this is an application specifically for federal student aid. However, a lot of other entities might use this information to award their aid. So for example, your state might use the FAFSA to determine your financial need for their state aid programs. A school, so a college or a university, may use it for some of their scholarship or grant programs that they award from the institution level. and even private entities. So private scholarships or places that hand out grants may use FAFSA information to determine eligibility. So although it is an application for federal student aid, the information on it may also be used for other types of aid. The FAFSA does open up on October 1st of each year. And so that's going to be October 1st of a student's senior year of college, or sorry, a senior year of high school. And they would be filling it out for their freshman year of college. And then it is something that they want to fill out each year that they're wanting to receive financial aid. And the due date is actually kind of all over the place depending on which school the student wants to attend. So each school does have a particular priority date that they ask students to submit their FAFSA by to be considered for limited funding, such as need-based grants or particular work study dollars. And so when you are filling out the FAFSA, what a student is filling it out for are federal grants, federal work study, and federal loans. And then, like I mentioned before, other entities might use it for scholarships, grants, and other aid that they hand out.
But the earlier the better, right, Leah?
Absolutely. So the earlier that you can apply for the FAFSA, the better off you're going to be. So I always encourage students and families to put it on their calendar in that month of October and just get it done and over with at that point. All right, so I just like to give people a visual of what the website looks like where they are applying for the FAFSA. So the website that one would go to fill out the FAFSA is studentaid.gov. And this is what the main web page looks like. Typically, what's highlighted during this time of the year is the FAFSA application. So right now you have student loan debt relief kind of being highlighted at this point in time. But what you will see on the right side of the page there is that there is a link for applying for aid using the FAFSA form. So this is what you'll see when you go to that studentaid.gov website. So the very first step in filling out the FAFSA is actually having a student create their login information. And so we refer to that as the FSA ID. And so what the FSA ID is their username and their password. And this needs to be created for the student who is applying for financial aid. And then if they are considered to be a dependent student, which means that they are required to have parent information on the FAFSA, then at least one of the parents will also need to create an FSA ID and their username and password. Dependency status commonly is a point of confusion for families. And so what I would like to point out is that there are multiple questions on the FAFSA that determine whether or not a student is required to put parent information on the FAFSA. So if they answer those questions in a way that requires that parent information, then the family would know that a parent is going to need some login information as well. So it's always just a safe bet for our graduating seniors from high school to create their own FSA ID, and then a parent to also create an FSA ID just from the get-go. So what do I need to create an FSA ID? An individual who's creating this login information will need a social security number, they will need a phone number, and they will need a personal email address. If you have those three things, you should be able to go through the steps of creating this login information. And then what is this used for? So the very first thing that it's used for is to be able to log in and start filling out your FAFSA. It is also used at the end of the FAFSA form to electronically sign the FAFSA. So this will be used as the student's electronic signature and then also the parent's electronic signature if they also have to sign the FAFSA. And then it's also used to access other benefits or places on the studentaid.gov website. So for example, once a student is in college and let's say they start borrowing federal loans, this login information can be used to log into the studentaid.gov website to track their loan debt at that point. A new part of setting up your FSA ID process is the two-step verification portion. So this is something brand new this year that has caused a couple of hiccups for families and students who are creating this login information. So I just wanted to point out that what this is the federal government is now requiring this two-step authentication whenever a student or an individual logs into their FSA ID account. And so as a part of setting up your FSA ID, you will need to verify your phone number and your email address if you provided one or both of those as part of your process for setting up this account. And then every time you log in after that, they will send you a code that you'll need in order to complete your login process. So it's very important that as a part of this process, you verify your contact information so you can get that code and get logged in successfully. All right, so when you go to studentaid.gov and click on I want to apply for the FAFSA, this is the page that will come up, and you'll have an option to either start a new FAFSA or log in as a returning user. So depending on where a student is, if they are, this is like their very first year of applying to the FAFSA, or maybe this is their third year of applying to the FAFSA, they'll choose the option based off of that. And then what does a student or family need to fill out the FAFSA? So the very first thing that I want to emphasize is that a individual will need a social security number in order to complete the FAFSA. And the reason that I've highlighted it or circled it here is because that social security number is very important in schools identifying who you are and being able to pull your FAFSA information into their system. So every school kind of matches your information that they have at their school with what you've reported on the FAFSA. And so if for some reason you've provided an incorrect social security number on the FAFSA, your school is not going to receive the information that you've submitted. So if nothing else, I always tell families to double check that social security number that their student entered in at least 3 times to make sure that it is correct. Otherwise, you're going to have issues. And the other thing is that if for some reason it is incorrect, then a student can't just go back in and fix the social security number. They'll actually have to refill out the entire FAFSA over again to fix the problem. So it's very important that that social is correct the first time to avoid any issues. The next thing that a student will need is their driver's license number. They'll also need to provide some contact information, so a phone number and a personal email address. One common thing that ends up happening with students is that they will provide their high school email address or their college email address if they've already applied and been admitted into school. And that's fine, but we would actually really suggest that students use a personal email address that they know they will have continued access to even after graduating high school or college. The reason for that is because notifications will be sent out to students to this email. And if you lose access to your high school email or your college email after a certain amount of time, then you're not going to receive those notifications. So we suggest using a personal email address. And then a student will also need to have a list of the schools that they're interested in attending. A student can put up to 10 schools on the FAFSA. And so they'll just need to know which schools those are so that when they get to that point, they can fill that part out. We then have some of the more complicated information that needs to be provided by students and then also their parents if parent information is required on the FAFSA. So those would be things like your 2021 federal income tax return information, any records of any untaxed income that a student or parent might have, a record of any assets that a student or parent might hold, access to bank statements, and then of course, like we talked about before, your FSA ID and password. So all of those pieces of information will be needed from a student if it's applicable to them, and then also a parent if they are required to be on the FAFSA.
Leah, when a student or parent creates an FSA ID and password, they can't go directly into FAFSA. How many days does it take for the FSA ID and password to be verified so then they can sign their FAFSA?
Yeah, typically that'll take about 3 days at most for it to be verified. All right, so when filling out the FAFSA, there are actually quite a few common obstacles that students and families run into. And some of them would be less obvious than you would think. So the most common obstacle that we see is incorrect social security numbers, names, or birth dates. And so, you know, we all think, oh, it's our information, we know what these things are, but people accidentally type in the wrong things all the time. So like I expressed before, triple check everything. And if nothing else, at least triple check that social security number. The biggest thing with names is that we have students who will enter in nicknames or middle names as their first name. And so again, they need to use their legal name on that FAFSA form. And then dates of birth, commonly things that get mixed up are months and days. So just making sure you're putting it in the right format. So triple check all of that information. I already talked about before with the email address, using a personal email address that you'll have ongoing access to is very important in the process. So you'll continue to receive those notifications throughout your entire college going process. We then have dependency questions. So there are a variety of different questions on the FAFSA that determine whether or not a student has to have parent information on the FAFSA. Basically, if all of the questions that determine dependency status are answered no, then parent information is required on the FAFSA. So these are questions like, have you served in the military? Are you married? Do you have your own child? These are all questions asked to the student. And if they don't answer yes to any of those questions, parent info is required on the FAFSA. We do have some particular situations, and we'll talk about them a little bit later, in which a student can't answer yes to any of those questions, but they still have a situation in which they can't get parent information on the FAFSA. And so we would always encourage students, if they're in that type of situation where they're just not really sure if they can put parent info on the FAFSA, to follow up with their school's financial aid office. Another common obstacle is tax information. So a lot of people get really antsy and scared of the FAFSA because they have to fill out all this financial information just like they do for their taxes each year. There's a really great tool in the FAFSA called the IRS Data Retrieval Tool that we encourage students and families to use if they are eligible to do so. And most people are eligible to use the IRS Data Retrieval Tool. And so that's going to help cut the amount of time it takes for you to fill out this form. There are then a ton of questions that ask untaxed income and asset information. And so some of those questions can be a little hard to translate because it's a lot of specific financial, lingo. There are a bunch of helpful hints and tips on the FAFSA. So if you highlight over any of the question marks that are next to each question on the FAFSA, you'll be able to see hints and tips, definitions of certain terms, or in some cases, they'll even link you to websites where you can find more information about what it is that they're asking from you. And then signatures. So it's very common that students and families will get through the entire FAFSA form, but then forget to sign and submit the FAFSA. So we always encourage students and families to have their FSA IDs ready to go so that they can go ahead and complete that signature process and submit once they're done with the form. If you are ever stuck in any of these places on the FAFSA form or unsure what the FAFSA is asking of you, I always encourage students and families to reach out to the school that they are wanting to attend, or one of the schools if you're applying to many of them, to see if they can help you out with any of those questions. Your financial aid counselors in those financial aid offices are trained on the FAFSA and should be able to help you through any obstacles you encounter. All right. So another obstacle that individuals might run into when filling out the FAFSA actually happens after the FAFSA is complete, and that is a process called verification. So this is something that the federal government selects individual FAFSAs for. And so after someone has submitted the FAFSA, they'll get a notification of whether or not they've been selected for verification. And then eventually their school will reach out to them to request documentation and further information from the student in order to complete the verification process. What I like to point out is that this is just a process to confirm that the information that was reported on the FAFSA is correct, so that the student gets the correct amount of financial aid. It doesn't mean that the student or the family did anything wrong on the FAFSA. It's not that they answered things incorrectly. It's just a process that the federal government has in place to make sure information is correct. And about 17% of FAFSAs currently get selected for this process. And that number has actually lowered over the past couple of years. So this process is done through your school. And so you'll submit any documentation or information through the student's school. And it's as easy as providing the documents that a student used to fill out the FAFSA. So normally what they're requesting is going to be things like tax information, your untaxed income information, asset information. So they would provide those documents, financial aid offices review those documents, and then eventually once the process is complete, the financial aid office can then review the student's FAFSA for aid eligibility. All right, so I mentioned a little bit before that there are some situations in which a student can't provide parent information on the FAFSA, but then there are also some situations in which a student or family's financial information might change, or their family situation might change between the time that they filed the FAFSA and the time that they're attending school. And so any of these types of situations are typically going to be referred to as special circumstances or professional judgment situations. And so a special circumstance or professional judgment in a financial aid office at a school is just a process that is used to correct or change that information on the FAFSA due to a change in the family or student's situation. And so if anything has ever changed, or you're unsure of how to approach filling out parent information on the FAFSA because you can't do that, then a student would need to reach out to their financial aid office at their school to start this special circumstance or professional judgment process. And typically this process is going to require documentation and filling out a form and communicating with that financial aid office about what's going on. So some scenarios that might be a red flag to sort of indicate that a student might need to go through this process would be if they are a foster youth or homeless youth. So these students actually will have questions on the FAFSA that they can answer. Yes, I was a foster youth during a certain time period, or yes, I am homeless or at risk of being homeless. And if that is the case, then the FAFSA sort of understands that they probably can't put parent information, or they might not be able to put parent information, but it doesn't stop asking them to put parent information. And so those students will just need to continue to fill out the FAFSA the best way that they can. They can skip the parent information part and submit the FAFSA, but then they would want to reach out to their school's financial aid office to say, hey, here's my situation. How do I make it so that I don't need parent information on the FAFSA? And again, this would be them submitting a form, some sort of documentation or statement regarding their situation, and then the financial aid office will determine whether or not they can move forward with just having the student's information on the FAFSA. We then have students who have parent information on the FAFSA, or have financial changes in their family situation. So these would be scenarios like a parent is attending college. Right now, the FAFSA doesn't allow for parents attending college to affect how much financial aid eligibility a student has. So if you want to have that taken into consideration, you do have to go through a special circumstance process with the financial aid office at the school. We have situations where families or students will have a loss of income. So maybe they changed jobs and now they're getting paid less than they did in their previous job, or maybe they lost their job. And so it could be a situation where they were fired, or maybe they quit. It doesn't really matter what the situation is, but they may have lost their job, and so now they don't have that income. Or we have parents who retire while their child is in college, and so that would also be considered a loss of income. In some cases, they have a limited amount of income compared to what they were earning when they were working. And so any of those types of situations can be considered in a special circumstance process. And we would encourage students and families to reach out to the financial aid office to talk about what that loss looks like. And usually financial aid offices will be able to do some sort of calculation to let the family know, is this process worth going through or not? Is the loss big enough to really make a change in your financial aid eligibility? So we always encourage students and families to reach out about those situations. We then, of course, have situations in which, the marital status of parents change, or even the marital status of a student might change. So in cases of marriage or divorce, that can change the financial picture of a family and of a student. So if anything like that happens, married, divorce, separation, we encourage you to reach out to the financial aid office to see if it changes what should be reported on the FAFSA and how you're being considered for aid. And then the last category is an increase in non-discretionary expenses. So typically these would be things like having a large amount of medical bills due to an unforeseen medical issue, having a large amount of tuition bills because you have multiple students in college, or you're paying private school tuition for a high school student, things along those lines. So stuff that's sort of out of your control. Sometimes schools will consider those non-discretionary expenses and be able to change your aid eligibility based off of those expenses. So those are just some scenarios. And so if you ever come across any students who kind of mention something along these lines, push them towards the financial aid office, have them explain their situation, and the financial aid office will be able to tell them whether or not it's something they can consider. Obviously, these situations are very personal. It can be pretty complicated sometimes, and documentation may be difficult to collect at first, but we always encourage students to just be as transparent as they can about these situations. The financial aid office isn't there to judge, they're there to help.
Good points, Leah. For counselors, I thought when I first started college counseling that we didn't have these situations in my district. And as time went on, we had more and more of those issues, and then COVID hit. And so this year's senior class is using 2021 tax information, which means COVID probably hit them. But before all this started, I had a student whose mom's income looked too much for financial aid, and they didn't get any aid. And we started talking, and I knew the history of the family. And the mom had Hodgkin's lymphoma and hadn't worked for years, and then had to have a kidney transplant, still didn't work for years. And so when she went back to work, on paper under W-2, her income looked great. So I had heard this on a webinar once, and I went help them go to the Office of Financial Aid at her college, and they filed an appeal, and I helped them scan and upload PDFs and email everybody. And they adjusted her financial aid to that college, and she ended up going where she wanted to go, University of Kansas. So as a counselor, the family's history, and you're the one that's trained to deal with those delicate situations. So just be open to helping them and reach out to the college's financial aid office.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing, is that financial aid offices, they don't know that a light bulb is out until someone tells them. And so just very important for folks to be communicating with their office, even if they're not sure if that situation can be taken into consideration, because you never know. All right, so I did want to address a little bit about the types of aid that might be available out there for students. And so the four main categories of financial aid are going to be grants, work study, loans, and scholarships. So the first one is grants, and typically people will refer to this as free money. It's money you don't have to pay back. Typically, students do have to meet a certain set of criteria to be eligible for grants. So usually that criteria is going to be need-based. And so what you'll see on the right side is some financial aid lingo. So I'll address merit-based versus need-based. So when we say need-based aid, what we're typically talking about in the financial aid world is that this is aid based off of a student's financial need. And financial need is something that is calculated by the FAFSA. So a financial aid office will take a student's FAFSA information as well as the school's cost information and determine what a student's financial need is. And so if a student does have financial need calculated with that methodology, then they could potentially be eligible for need-based aid such as grants. There are also need-based scholarships out there, need-based aid in all categories. So that is what need-based aid means. We then have merit-based aid, which is typically going to be based off of like your GPA, ACT score, or some sort of achievement that you've had. And so when we're looking at grants, usually it's going to be need-based. You may have some grants out there that are based off of identifying as a particular group. So for example, we have Native American tribes who hand out grants to their students. But that category, again, is usually free money that you don't have to pay back. We then have what's called federal work study. Some states also have state work study programs. And basically what work study is it's money that a student earns while they're working a job. So it's really no different from any other job that an individual has and is getting paid for. They work a certain amount of hours for an employer. Typically, these jobs are going to be on campus, so students have more flexibility in when they need to work, and employers will work around their school schedule and their final schedule. But they earn a paycheck just like any other job that they would have. The only difference is that these jobs that are available on campuses are available because part of the student's income is being funded by work study dollars. And so it creates those work opportunities for students on campus. We then have loans. So if a student is interested in taking out loans, there are a variety of different types of loans that they can look at. The FAFSA is your application for federal student loans. So students will automatically be eligible for a certain amount of loans based off of what year in college they are. And then there are two different types of loans that they can take out, subsidized and unsubsidized. So we'll go over that in just a minute. But then there are also things like parent loans, and that is a loan that a parent can take out. And then there are things like private loans. And so these would be loans that are through places like Discover, Sallie Mae, Wells Fargo, places that offer private student loans that have nothing to do with the federal government. But loans are funding that needs to be paid back, and typically paid back with interest. And so they are not that free money. And then you have scholarships. Scholarships are typically going to be based off of some sort of achievement, some sort of GPA, ACT, or something that you have done. Some scholarships will require an essay. They require you to do some sort of project. So typically there's some effort that has to be put in order to be considered for the funding. And then you are typically put through a selection process by a committee who then selects you for this scholarship. But usually when you receive the scholarship, it is not something that you have to pay back. Okay, so With the financial aid lingo, we kind of talked about merit-based and need-based already. But then we also have these terms one-time versus renewable. And so this is referring to how often you can receive the particular award that you're looking at. So you sometimes have scholarships, for example, that are one-time awards. They only award you during your freshman year of college. But then you might have other scholarships or grants that are renewable. So you can renew those each year while you're in college. And so it is important that when students are looking at their aid package, that they understand which awards are one time and which awards are renewable from year to year. So going back to our loans conversation earlier, we then have federal loans versus private loans. So federal loans are going to be those student loans and parent loans that are through the federal government. And this is one of the things that a student is applying for when they fill out that FAFSA. Federal loans are the ones that have all sorts of protections when it comes to repayment plans, when it comes to pausing your payment due to certain financial situations. And so typically a financial aid office is going to encourage you to look at your federal loans before considering private loan options. But there are private loans out there, like I mentioned earlier, that are through a variety of different entities. So if a family or student is interested in borrowing private loans, they could definitely go out to a bank or agency that provides those and see what those options are. We then have student loans versus parent loans. So student loans are going to be loans that a student can borrow, typically on their own. They don't usually have to have a co-signer if we're looking at federal loans. But for private loans, if a student wants to borrow private loans, they typically will have to have a co-signer because most students are not going to be able to meet the financial requirements for those private loans on their own. So I think it's very important that when we're having the loan conversation, we're seeing, okay, which loans are for the student versus which loans are for the parent, because there's also this thing called the Parent Plus loan, which is a loan that a parent can borrow from the federal government. And that loan has no tie to the student. So if a parent decides to borrow it, it is a loan that is under the parent's name. Also with loans, we have subsidized versus unsubsidized loans. So really the difference between those is how much interest accrues. Subsidized loans are loans that do not accrue interest while the student is attending college. And so those loans will not start to accrue interest until after they stop enrolling or graduate college. Unsubsidized loans do accrue interest while a student is in college, and they will continue to accrue interest until that loan is fully paid off. Then the final two terms are just items that you might hear from the financial aid office. So the first one is satisfactory academic progress, otherwise known as SAP. These are academic standards that students have to meet in order to stay eligible for their federal aid. And so that academic standard is different from school to school, depending on a variety of different factors. So it's important that students know that they do have to keep their grades up and they do have to complete their classes in order to continue to receive federal aid. And then you also have cost of attendance, sometimes referred to as COA. And this is basically what a school has estimated it will cost a typical student to attend their college.
Leah, can you clarify a quick question about subsidized and unsubsidized? Am I correct that subsidized is you have to qualify for a financial need, and unsubsidized, everyone qualifies for an unsubsidized loan? Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. So a student can only get a subsidized loan if they have financial need as calculated through the federal aid methodology process. And so your financial aid office at your school would be able to tell you if you're eligible for a subsidized loan. Unsubsidized loans are available to all students. So regardless of what's reported on the FAFSA, any student should be able to take out an unsubsidized loan if they need to. All right, so then we have financial aid packages. So after you've gone through the process of submitting the FAFSA and gone through any extra processes that a student might need to go through with their financial aid office, eventually the financial aid office is going to send out a financial aid package to the student. And sometimes they will also send this out to parents if they have that contact information. Typically, most schools are going to send out a financial aid package at any point between December through May. You may have some schools that are usually community colleges or tech schools that might not send it out until later in the summer, but most financial aid packages are going out between December and May. On the right side here, you'll see what's called the financial shopping sheet. This is something that the federal government has provided to schools to basically be able to provide a standard, hey, here's your cost, hey, here's your aid, here's what everything looks like. So a lot of schools will have this available through their financial aid system for students to be able to compare their financial aid packages with one another. So you'll see at the top there that it goes over the cost information. It then addresses the student's FAFSA information, and then it will kind of lay out how many scholarships the student has, grants, and any other types of aid that they're receiving. This isn't always what a school is using when they send out a financial aid package. Most schools actually have a separate thing that they send out to students or families that doesn't necessarily isn't this exact form, but it might look something similar to this. So when a student is looking at a financial aid package, a lot of the information that they need is going to be listed in some sort of format that is similar to this. So the other thing that when families and students are looking at financial aid packages, they should consider is what the sticker price is versus the net price. So typically in a financial aid package, they'll see all these different cost lists listed. They'll see tuition and fees, they'll see housing and meals, they'll see books and supplies. They might see estimates for things like transportation costs or other living costs that a student might have. And these are all estimates that an institution has sort of determined ahead of time. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the actual cost that the student has to pay each year or each semester. So when we talk about estimated costs, that's what the sticker price is. So then we talk about the net price. And the net price is that actual bill that a student receives each semester minus the actual aid that they receive. And so when a student is looking at a financial aid package, it's really important for them to pay attention to what those costs are minus those grants and scholarships, because that's the free money. And then if they do have to consider things like work study or loans, how much those pieces are and what that all comes out to in the end. Do they still have a leftover dollar amount that they are going to owe? Do they have $0 that they're going to owe? Do they have more aid than what the cost is going to be? And how does that kind of change their situation? So once a student has received all of their different financial aid packages, I usually encourage them to lay them all out side by side and just start doing the math. What does it look like? And just because a financial aid office or a school has given you the most aid, the highest dollar amount, doesn't always mean that that is the best package for you financially. And there are also a lot of other things to consider in the process, such as the program that a student wants to attend and whether or not that college is a good fit for them. So, the financial piece is one part and it's a big part, but there's a lot of other factors to consider in that process. So just some resources here that might be helpful to counselors as well as the students and families that you work with. The federal government has what's called a net price calculator search engine, basically, where you can go and enter in a college and it will take you straight to where their net price calculator is located on their website. And what a net price calculator is it's basically a way for someone to fill out some basic information, both like academic and financial information, to kind of determine what kind of aid they might get from that particular school before they actually fill out the FAFSA. And so it's a really good way to estimate things before you actually go through the entire process. So that collegecost.ed.gov/net-price, that is where you can search for different college net price calculators. You then have collegescorecard.ed.gov, which is another federal government website that students and families can use to compare colleges to one another. And one of the criteria that they can compare is financial aid, the typical amount of financial aid that students receive, as well as the typical amount of debt that they might take out at that particular school. So always good to know that when comparing schools, you got to take it with a grain of salt because each individual student's situation is different. But it is a helpful tool if a student is considering multiple schools at the same time. And then, of course, studentaid.gov is a great resource for students and families to learn about all the different types of federal aid that are offered and the process for filling that out. One last thing for me to point out is that in addition to the aid offered from a school, students and families should also consider the other resources that they might have in helping pay for school. So these could be things like the current income that the student or family is earning. Maybe they have, savings that they want to use to help pay for school. Some families might have what's called a 529 savings plan, which is something that they've actually invested in to help pay for college. And they can take payments out of that to help pay for things like tuition and fees. And then some schools also have payment plans where you can take the amount that you owe on a bill and pay it over a certain amount of time. Sometimes that's a couple of months, sometimes that's the whole academic year. It just depends on the school. So that is something to consider in addition to the financial aid that is offered from an institution and from the federal government. All right, so the very last thing that we'll talk about is what to look forward to. So a lot of you may have heard about this thing called FAFSA simplification, which is something that's going to happen in the coming years for FAFSA. And some of the simplified parts of the FAFSA have already started to be implemented. So what FAFSA simplification is it's basically the federal government simplifying the FAFSA process. They're trying to downsize the amount of questions that there are. They're trying to expand some eligibility and trying to make this FAFSA form a little less complicated for students and families to fill out. So I've listed here some changes that either already have happened or are going to happen very soon. So right now, the questions for selective service and drug convictions have been removed from the FAFSA and are no longer being considered for aid eligibility. And so students who have not signed up for selective service or students who have had a drug conviction in their past, they can now be considered for aid. Schools cannot, moving forward for the 2024-2025 FAFSA, schools will not be able to opt out of professional judgment reviews. So we talked about those special circumstances and professional judgments earlier. And so right now, technically a school could have a blanket policy where they won't consider any of those types of situations to make changes to the FAFSA, and that will no longer be allowable. So you could feel pretty confident moving forward that a school is not going to be able to tell a student, no, we don't consider changes. They'll have to let students go through that process. It hasn't happened yet, but eventually schools will be required to reach out to students who identify as homeless or identify as foster youth when they fill out the FAFSA. So once a student who has identified as one of those categories submits their FAFSA, schools will have to reach out and say, hey, we see you've identified this way. Here's our process for finishing up the FAFSA to take those identities into consideration. When students currently fill out the FAFSA and the FAFSA says that they're required to have parent information on the FAFSA, but a student doesn't provide parent information on the FAFSA, right now, that makes it so that the FAFSA is rejected. And so a school just can't process anything and can't really give the student information until everything's fixed. Moving forward with the 2024-2025 FAFSA, in some cases, there will be what's going to be called a provisional independent status. So basically what that means is that a student, after submitting the FAFSA, will be able to get an idea of how much in Pell Grant money they might be able to receive even before they go through the steps of finishing everything up with their financial aid office. And so that provisional independent status just means that a student will be provisionally considered an independent student without parent information on the FAFSA until they complete the process. The FAFSA simplification also expands Pell Grant eligibility. So one category of students who will now become eligible for the Pell Grant are incarcerated students. There are also going to be changes in how Pell Grants are calculated. And so they are predicting that there will be a larger amount of students eligible for the Pell Grant based off of these new calculations. The FAFSA is supposed to have less questions. So the big advertised thing is that it's supposed to go from 108 questions to 36 questions. So it should be shorter and easier for folks to fill out. Eventually, they, instead of opting into using that IRS data retrieval tool that I talked about earlier to bring your tax information over, they are going to instead automatically transfer your information over. So individuals won't necessarily have to go through the steps of opting into it or opting out of it. It'll just be an automatic transfer. A big change that is happening is that currently small businesses and family farms do not need to be reported on the FAFSA, but for 24-25, they will need to be reported. So families who have previously not reported those items will have to estimate their net worth for those businesses and family farms. And then probably the biggest thing that people have heard about is that the EFC, which is your expected family contribution, is the number that the FAFSA calculates, and that is going to be changed to what will be called the Student Aid Index, or SAI. And this is basically a change in name to help lessen the confusion about whether or not families actually have to pay that dollar amount. So the Student Aid Index is, it works a lot like the EFC, in which it determines what your aid eligibility is based off of FAFSA information. But we're calling it something different. The other big change with that is that students will be able to get a negative SAI. And so the lowest SAI will not be 0, it'll be negative 1,500. So really with the 2024-2025 FAFSA, I think the biggest thing to think about as a high school counselor is to reach out to your local financial aid office either before or around fall 2023 to see if they might be able to help do presentations to your students and families about, you know, the upcoming FAFSA and what all the changes will be. And then our Kansas Association actually does a bunch of trainings for high school counselors. And so in the coming year, they will start doing trainings for those changes to the FAFSA as well. So really important to reach out to your local organizations that can help you out with that information. All right, any questions?
I don't think we have questions because no one's on.
Okay.
I had a quick one, Ann.
Sure.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful. I had gone through this process a few years ago during my teaching degree, and one thing I wasn't aware of was that eventually my loan went to a servicer. Is that common? Do students eventually all get sort of funneled into a federal loan servicer?
Yes, so there are a variety of different loan servicers that a student or parent's federal loans will get assigned to. And so those typically get assigned within the year that they first get the loan dispersed through their school. And so they get notified on who that servicer is. And then when it comes time for repayment, all the communication starts coming from the servicer.
Okay. And do they typically stay with that servicer? They're not like bought and sold or anything?
So typically, let's say a student is going to a 4-year college. Over the 4 years that they're there, typically all of their loans are going to be assigned to the same servicer. So it's not usually going to be assigned to multiple different servicers during that time. However, at any point in time, if one of the servicers no longer decides to service federal loans, a student's loan might be sold to another servicer or transferred to another servicer as a part of that process. And that actually does happen and has happened pretty often in the last couple of years. But there's always a bunch of communication that goes out to students about when that's going to happen, when they need to make a new account with a new servicer. But it usually shouldn't affect the timing of their payments or how much they owe. Usually there shouldn't be an issue there, but if they do run into issues, they can always reach out to their new servicer and figure that out.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good info. I want to thank Leah for giving us her expertise today. I learned a ton. And counselors, if you have questions or you want to know how you can implement some of this with your students and families, reach out to me or Leah, and I'm sure we'd be willing to answer your questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening today, guys.